What if I told you that one of the most whispered royal rumors of the last 30 years, the one Buckingham Palace has denied, dismissed, and buried under layers of official statements and cold silence, has just been cracked open by one of the most powerful insiders the monarchy has ever known? And what if I also told you that the man breaking that silence isn't a fringe commentator, or a tabloid writer, or a disgruntled former staffer, but a man who has dined with kings, strategized with princes, defended the monarchy during its darkest hours, and stood closer to King Charles III than almost any other living human being? That man is Nicholas Soames, and his new remarks have ignited a firestorm that the palace hoped would never be reignited. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because if Nicholas Soames is truly revealing what people think he's revealing, the implications for Prince Harry, for the monarchy, and for the entire legacy of the House of Windsor are devastating. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the question no one in the royal family ever wants spoken aloud. Is James Hewitt really the father of Prince Harry? For decades, this question has hovered like a ghost over the monarchy. Sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, sometimes mocked, sometimes analyzed, but never fully silenced. You've seen the memes. You've heard the jokes. You've read the tabloid headlines. You've watched the interviews where journalists dance around the question, where royal watchers roll their eyes, where defenders of the crown insist it's all nonsense. And yet, the rumor never dies. It never disappears. It never loses its grip. Why? Because people feel that somewhere inside this rumor, hiding under the layers of official statements, Palmerstonian secrecy, and stiff-lipped royal messaging, there is something the palace is terrified to acknowledge, even in private. And whenever a powerful figure like Nicholas Soames opens his mouth, even slightly, about the topic, the world listens. But before we get to Soames' bombshell, we need to understand the battlefield. Because this story isn't just about Harry's paternity. It's about identity. It's about loyalty. It's about legitimacy. It's about the monarchy's obsession with bloodlines and image. And it's about how one rumor, one question, one whisper can destabilize an institution older than many empires. Let me ask you a direct question. Have you ever noticed how hard the palace fights this rumor? Not ignores, not brushes aside, not shrugs off. Fights. With intensity, with force, with a level of anger and defensiveness that always seems disproportionate. Think about it. This family endures constant scrutiny. They ignore 99% of the nonsense written about them. But this rumor? This rumor makes normally composed royals snap. Why? Because it cuts to the heart of everything the monarchy stands for. Lineage, succession, blood, heritage. A monarchy without a legitimate bloodline is a monarchy in crisis. And Harry, whether he wanted it or not, has always carried the weight of that expectation. Now, imagine growing up with the world speculating about whether your real father is the man married to your mother or a charming cavalry officer who had an affair with her. Imagine the jokes, the whispers, the headlines, the snickers from classmates, the questions from journalists pretending to be subtle. Imagine your entire existence being discussed as though you were a character in a soap opera rather than a child. And now imagine that inside the palace. Behind locked doors, behind old oak panels, behind layers of royal protocol, there were conversations, meetings, arguments, and decisions about what to do if the rumor spiraled out of control. Because here's the part the public never sees. The rumor didn't start in the tabloids. It didn't begin with James Hewitt's red hair or Harry's infectious smile. It began inside the palace itself. People forget this. The whispers started long before the Daily Mail or the Sun splashed them across their pages. They started in hushed discussions among courtiers, in nervous exchanges between advisors, intense arguments between spouses, in worried briefings to senior royals, in private letters, in subtle glances, in the uncomfortable silence that fills a room when someone says something everyone has secretly thought, but no one has dared to say aloud. This rumor wasn't born in a newsroom. It was born in a palace. And there was one man, more than any other, who tried to smother it before it escaped into the wild. Nicholas Soames, Churchill's grandson, a titan of the British establishment, a lifelong friend of King Charles, a man with political power, social influence, royal connections, and a volcanic temper when it came to defending the crown. He defended Charles not like a friend, but like a soldier defending a king. And that's why his recent revelation, a revelation carefully worded, ominously phrased, and delivered with the weight of someone who knows far more than he's allowed to admit, has stunned royal watchers. But before we break down what Soames actually said, and why the palace is desperately trying to pretend it never happened, we need to understand the players. Let's start with Prince Harry. You know his public story. The charming spare, the rebellious prince, the soldier, the activist, the runaway royal. The man who walked away from the monarchy and detonated the biggest royal scandal since the abdication of Edward VIII. But there is another Harry, the private Harry, the one shaped by decades of whispers he never asked for. He didn't choose this rumor. He didn't create it. He didn't benefit from it. It's haunted him. It's defined perception of him. It's been weaponized against him. Every time Harry smiles, someone brings up James Hewitt. Every time he frowns, someone says he looks like Diana. Every time he walks into a room, someone whispers, "Look at the hair." But here's the truth. Harry doesn't look like James Hewitt. He looks like Diana's brother, Charles Spencer. He looks like young members of the Spencer family. He looks like Diana herself. But the rumor persists because it feeds the public imagination. And that is where James Hewitt enters. You know him. The cavalry officer with the red hair, the charming grin, the romantic storyline with Diana. A man who was both a lover and a liability. A man who became infamous against his will, and later, perhaps, willingly. His relationship with Diana began in 1986. Harry was born in 1984. Case closed? Logically, yes. But rumors don't follow logic. Rumors follow emotion. The world saw Hewitt's hair. They saw Harry's hair. They connected dots that weren't there. And once the story spread, nothing could stop it. Not facts, not evidence, not denials, not timelines. And the palace? Terrified. Because they knew even a fabricated rumor could damage the one thing the monarchy needs above all, stability. Now, let's look at Diana. She adored Harry. She protected him fiercely. She also, on several occasions, spoke truth in ways that made the palace shudder. When she talked, the world listened. When she cried, the world cried. When she hinted at secrets, the world hung onto every breath. And Diana, in her vulnerability, sometimes spoke about her pain, her loneliness, her affairs, her need for love, her frustration with the monarchy. So people asked her, and she answered directly. She insisted James Hewitt was not Harry's father. She insisted the affair began after Harry's birth. She denied every whisper. But the public didn't care. The media didn't care. The monarchy didn't trust that her statements would be the end of it, because some inside the palace believed the rumor had to be shut down. Not through interviews, not through statements, but through something much more drastic. And that's when the first whispers of a paternity test surfaced. Did it happen? Who ordered it? Who saw the results? Where was it stored? Why was it hidden? And why did the palace panic whenever the topic came up? These questions have followed the monarchy for 30 years. And this is where Nicholas Soames enters the story like a storm. In the early years, he attacked the rumor aggressively. He didn't tiptoe. He didn't use diplomatic language. He didn't offer polite clarifications. He thundered. He barked. He scolded. He treated the rumor like an insult to the crown itself. But decades later, when asked again, Soames didn't repeat his explosive denial. He didn't reaffirm his certainty with fire and fury. Instead, he went silent. Thoughtful, measured, careful. A careful man is a dangerous man, especially when he has nothing to gain from caution unless the truth is heavier than the lie. And in his most recent statement, the one that sent royal reporters scrambling, he made a comment that was short, cryptic, and chilling. A comment that hinted he knew far more than he had ever admitted before. A comment that suggested the palace did things behind closed doors that the public would never accept. A comment that brought the paternity question back to life in a way no journalist or royal watcher could ever have achieved. A comment that, if interpreted even slightly differently, changes everything. And that is where our story begins. Not with a rumor, not with a scandal, not with a tabloid headline, but with a powerful man, holding a dangerous truth, choosing to finally open the door, just a crack. Because according to one former royal advisor, Soames didn't just defend the crown. He helped cover up something the world was never meant to see. What if the rumor that shook the royal family didn't begin with a headline, or a leaked interview, or even a whisper from a former staff member, but with a single moment of fear deep inside Buckingham Palace? Imagine the corridors of the palace in the late 1980s, dimly lit, echoing with brisk footsteps, carrying the scent of polished wood and old stone. A time when Prince Charles and Princess Diana's marriage was quietly, painfully unraveling behind the scenes. A time when the public still believed in fairy tales, unaware that the fairy tale of Charles and Diana had already shattered into 1,000 pieces. And beneath that surface, hidden from cameras and newspapers and royal photographers, another fear was brewing. A fear so potent, so explosive, that even the suggestion of it was enough to make senior advisors break into whispers. That fear? The possibility that the succession line could one day be questioned because of a rumor that had not yet reached the outside world, but was already causing panic inside the palace walls. It always starts quietly. A glance, a comment, an uncomfortable silence. Before it becomes a headline, it's a whisper in a room where men in suits pretend to be calm but exchange looks that speak volumes. And that is exactly how the earliest version of the Harry isn't Charles's son rumor began. Not with the public, not with tabloids, but with insiders who noticed something they couldn't unnotice. Let's go back to when Prince Harry was still a toddler. The world saw a charming, cheeky, ginger-haired boy with Diana's spark in his eyes and Charles's posture. But inside the palace, those early years were overshadowed by a growing coldness between Charles and Diana. The fairy tale wedding had ended. The illusion was fading. Infidelities had begun. Diana sought affection where she could find it, and Charles returned to Camilla. The marriage was crumbling, and everyone inside those walls could feel it. And when a marriage crumbles inside a monarchy built on image, lineage, and duty, people start looking for signs, real or imagined, that something even bigger might be wrong. So imagine an advisor watching Diana walk down a corridor holding baby Harry, noticing the baby's red hair, and thinking, just thinking, that this child looked different. Not wrong, not suspicious, just different enough to plant the seed of doubt. One thought becomes two. Two thoughts become a whisper. A whisper becomes a rumor. And a rumor, once born in a place as paranoid as Buckingham Palace, becomes a crisis. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that the Harry/Hewitt rumor didn't explode until Harry was older, but the palace was fighting it long before anyone in the public was even talking about it? That's because the earliest whispers were internal. They came from staff, from advisors, from people who understood the stakes. And here's where it gets interesting. Those whispers didn't immediately connect Harry to James Hewitt. Those early rumors came before Diana ever publicly admitted to any affair, before Hewitt even became a household name. The timeline of the rumor and the timeline of the affair are tragically mismatched, but rumors don't care about reality. They care about fear. Fear is the real author of scandal. Fear writes the first draft. And inside the palace, fear was everywhere. By the mid-1980s, Diana was lonely. Charles was withdrawn. Advisors described their marriage as frozen, frigid, a dead room. Charles was frustrated that Diana outshone him in public. Diana was devastated that Charles still loved Camilla. Their arguments leaked through the walls. Their sadness was palpable. Harry was born into a family already disintegrating. And this is what the public never saw. Every time Diana went riding with a handsome cavalry officer, people inside the palace noticed. Every time she sought comfort from someone who wasn't Charles, whispers grew louder. Every time she appeared without Charles, someone asked why. Because Diana was everything the monarchy wasn't: emotional, vulnerable, open, unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies institutions built on control. This is where Nicholas Soames first enters the story. Not with a loud statement, not with a press interview, but in the background, as Charles's fiercely loyal confidant. Soames wasn't just a family friend. He was Charles's defender, his shield, his voice, the man who spoke the harsh truths Charles couldn't bring himself to say. Even back then, Soames was preparing for war. Not a physical war, a reputational one. A war against anything, anyone, that could threaten the crown. And Harry's paternity was the ultimate threat. Let's step into a hypothetical meeting room. A group of senior advisors. A tense atmosphere. Diana's name is mentioned, and people shift uncomfortably. A question hangs in the air, but no one wants to speak it. Is Harry really Charles's son? Not because they believed he wasn't, but because they feared what would happen if anyone outside the palace thought so. Fear isn't logical. Fear is destructive. Fear makes people take extreme measures. And if you think they didn't consider extreme measures, think again. Before the world even knew Diana had affairs, before her interview with Panorama, before the tabloids splashed her confessions across their front pages, the palace was already discussing the optics of Harry's appearance. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything else in Charles and Diana's marriage was. And when people are unhappy, gossip spreads like a virus. Now imagine Charles, who has always been intensely sensitive to public perception, being told there were whispers questioning Harry's paternity. Imagine his humiliation, the anger, the fear that his own son, his beloved son, could be dragged into the mud because of the failures of his marriage. Because for all his flaws, Charles adored Harry. He adored him from the moment he held him. Those who knew Charles say he was more relaxed around Harry than around William. He felt freer with him. Harry made him laugh. Harry softened him. So imagine what it felt like to hear people whispering the unthinkable, whispering that Harry might not be his. Charles wasn't furious at the suggestion because he doubted Harry. He was furious because he knew what the world would do with that suggestion. And he was right. We've all seen it. 3 decades later, the rumor still lives. But here's the twist. The palace's attempt to kill the rumor is exactly what kept it alive. Because in their desperation to silence it, they poured gasoline on it. People only try to silence things that are dangerous. So the public assumed the rumor must be dangerous. And dangerous rumors become immortal. But the most fascinating part of Chapter 1, the part most people never hear about, is this. The early Harry/Hewitt rumor spread quietly within the palace long before anyone whispered Hewitt's name. The palace feared the existence of a question before it ever had a name attached. It was only years later, when Diana's affair with James Hewitt became public, that the rumor found its perfect villain. And that's when everything exploded. Let's talk about timing. Diana began her affair with Hewitt in 1986. Harry was born in 1984. Hewitt is not Harry's father. That's a fact. But rumors don't care about facts. They care about convenience. And when Diana's affair became public knowledge, the earlier whispers rushed back like a tidal wave, this time attaching themselves to a name that fit the public imagination. A cavalry officer. Red hair. Close to Diana. Photogenic. Charming. Emotional. Willing to talk. He was the perfect narrative. The perfect scandal. The perfect weapon. And the media used him like a battering ram. But don't forget this. By the time the world connected Harry and Hewitt, the palace had already been dealing with internal whispers for years. They knew the damage a rumor like this could cause. And it wasn't just Charles's reputation at stake. It was the future of the monarchy itself. Because if the public ever believed, even for a moment, that Harry was not of royal blood, the institution risked collapsing under the weight of that doubt. That's the real danger. Not truth. Not lies. Doubt. Doubt is the destroyer of thrones. And no one understood that better than Nicholas Soames. This is why his early involvement matters. Why his comments decades later matter even more. Why every word he says on the topic is treated like a seismic event. Soames wasn't just Charles's friend. He was Charles's eyes, ears, and sword. He was the man who went on national radio and angrily defended Charles when the rumor first reached the public. He was the man who scolded the media. He was the man who attacked Diana's credibility during the infamous BBC Panorama fallout. He was the man who insisted, loudly, aggressively, that Harry was Charles's son. And yet, decades later, when asked again, he no longer spoke with that same fire. He no longer roared with certainty. He no longer slammed the door shut. He no longer defended Charles with the fury of a man protecting a king. He became careful, measured, cryptic. A cryptic Soames is more dangerous than an angry Soames. Because an angry man denies everything. A careful man avoids revealing the truth. And that's exactly where this story begins to twist, darken, and accelerate. What if one closed-door meeting inside Buckingham Palace, long before the public ever knew a rumor existed, set the entire chain of events in motion? And what if the people in that room weren't just discussing gossip, but a crisis that could threaten the survival of the monarchy itself. Picture this. A cloudy London afternoon in the late 1980s. Rain streaks the palace windows in thin, diagonal lines. Inside, the air feels heavy. Too heavy. The kind of heaviness that settles in a room when the people in it know they are about to discuss something that should never, ever leave those walls. A small group of senior royal advisors walks in, each one stiff, silent, aware that the topic on the table is not a matter of scheduling or public appearances, but something darker, something dangerous. That meeting, according to insiders, became one of the most quietly explosive moments in modern royal history. Because it wasn't just about Charles and Diana's failing marriage. It wasn't just about public perception. It wasn't just about affairs or accusations or media storms. It was about something far more primal: succession, the continuation of the monarchy itself. Let me ask you directly. Have you ever wondered why the palace reacts with such ferocity whenever Harry's paternity is questioned? Why they don't just brush it off with a laugh and let the rumor die on its own? Why the reaction always feels like overkill? This is why. This meeting is why. This fear is why. Because long before James Hewitt's name was attached to anything, long before Diana admitted to anything, long before the public whispered a single word, something inside the palace triggered alarm bells. We don't know who spoke first. We don't know who said the actual words. But we know what those words implied. Is it possible Harry might not be Charles's biological son? Now, let me be clear. No one had evidence. No one had a reason. No one had a confession. No one had a timeline suggesting anything inappropriate. This wasn't logic. This was fear. Fear of a collapsing marriage. Fear of a lonely princess seeking emotional support from anyone who offered it. Fear that the monarchy's most fragile couple was becoming the monarchy's ticking time bomb. And, most importantly, fear that the world, once it smelled that weakness, would devour them. Understand something crucial. Royal advisors aren't trained for compassion. They're trained for crisis. They don't ask how someone feels. They ask what could go wrong. What could leak? What could create scandal? What could endanger the crown? And in their eyes, Diana was a wild card. Beautiful, beloved, hurting, and emotionally unpredictable. She shared her feelings. She shared her pain. She shared her doubts. And that vulnerability scared the establishment. She wasn't supposed to talk. She wasn't supposed to cry. She wasn't supposed to admit that her marriage was collapsing. And she definitely wasn't supposed to admit, years later, that she had sought comfort elsewhere. But even before Diana's affairs became public, the palace feared she might have had one. Not because she did, but because unhappy people sometimes do. And if she did, and if someone else was the father, and if that someone ever talked, the monarchy's legitimacy could implode. That's the fear that drove that early meeting. Now imagine the advisors seated around a polished mahogany table, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Some try to appear calm, but their legs bounce under the table. Others grip their pens tightly, knuckles white. A few exchange glances that say, "Are we really doing this? Are we really talking about this?" But once the topic is raised, no one dares retract it. And so they ask the questions they hope never become public. What if the rumor spreads? What if the press gets hold of anything? What if a former lover of Diana speaks? What if someone claims Harry isn't Charles's son? How do we respond? Do we ignore it? Do we deny it? Do we bury it? Do we prepare a strategy? Here's where the psychology becomes fascinating. When people fear a rumor, they accidentally validate it. By discussing the possibility privately, the palace created the very paranoia they were afraid of. Because once someone says, "We need to make sure no one thinks Harry isn't Charles's son," suddenly every advisor starts seeing shadows. They watch Diana's movements more closely. They scrutinize Harry's appearance. They analyze timelines. They question people they once trusted. They wonder who might leak. They worry about potential threats that might not even exist. Fear breeds delusion. Delusion breeds rumor. And rumor, once born, becomes indestructible. Now enter Nicholas Soames. He wasn't in the room, at least not officially. But he was Charles's closest ally. The man Charles called when he needed firepower. The man who defended him in Parliament. The man who scolded journalists. The man who protected the monarchy like a knight in a modern political battlefield. If something threatened Charles's dignity or legitimacy, Soames didn't just step in. He charged in. And according to those who understand the royal machinery, Soames was informed early on, long before the rest of the world ever heard a whisper. Not because he had official authority, but because he was the kind of man you told when you needed help handling a crisis. If Charles was worried, Soames was told. If Diana's behavior raised concerns, Soames was told. If the advisors panicked, Soames was told. And Soames, with his military sternness and his booming voice, became an unofficial defender of Harry's legitimacy long before the world ever questioned it. But here's the twist. Soames' early involvement also means he knew the deepest fears of the establishment. He knew who was whispering what. He knew which advisors doubted Diana. He knew which ones feared a scandal. He knew how fragile the public image was. He knew how dangerous even a single rumor could be. And once he knew that, he understood that this story, this rumor, would one day become a weapon. Now, let's go back into the room. One advisor says something like, "We must control the narrative before it controls us." Another responds, "But there is no narrative. There is no issue." A third interrupts, "That doesn't matter. The appearance alone could be damaging." Appearance, not reality. Appearance. That's when they begin constructing the palace strategy that would define decades of denials. Harry's paternity must never be discussed publicly. Any reporter asking about it must be shut down immediately. Any comparison to Hewitt must be destroyed. Any implication must be labeled as malicious gossip. Anyone repeating the rumor must be portrayed as attacking the crown. And this is exactly why, decades later, Nicholas Soames reacted so violently on national radio when someone brought up the rumor. He wasn't reacting to the tabloid version of the rumor. He was reacting to the original fear, the fear that began in rooms like this one. To him, the rumor wasn't just wrong. It was treasonous. A threat to the legitimacy of the monarchy, a threat to Charles, a threat to everything he believed in. But there is another layer to this moment, a darker one, a more secretive one, because during that early meeting, after an hour or two of tension, someone finally said the words no one wanted to say. What if we tested it? Silence. Complete. Frozen. Stunning. The kind of silence that makes grown men avoid eye contact. The kind of silence that turns a room colder. This wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a belief. It wasn't a conclusion. It was fear talking. Just fear. And fear doesn't need evidence to justify itself. Now imagine the reaction. One advisor slams his pen down, furious. Another insists that even suggesting such a thing is an insult to the princess. Another warns that if word ever leaked, the monarchy would be doomed. Another argues that certainty might be the only protection they have. Another says Charles must never know this meeting took place. Another refuses to even entertain the question. Voices rise. Tempers flare. Hands shake. Aides shift uncomfortably. The room becomes a mixture of shock, embarrassment, anger, and terror. But once the idea is spoken, it cannot be unspoken. And that is how the earliest seed of the secret paternity test rumor was planted. Not because a test happened, but because advisors feared that one day, something might force them to consider it. Fear becomes rumor. Rumor becomes narrative. Narrative becomes inside knowledge. And decades later, people treat it as fact. This meeting created the monster. Not Diana. Not Hewitt. Not Harry. The advisors created it by fearing it. And the most chilling part? That fear never went away. Even after Diana's death. Even after Harry grew up. Even after Charles remarried. Even after the public moved on. Inside the palace, they still feared the rumor. And that fear guided decisions none of US knew were being made. Now, fast forward many years. The rumor reaches the press. It spreads like wildfire. It becomes a global obsession. And once again, the palace calls in its unofficial enforcer, Nicholas Soames. He goes on radio. He goes on television. He issues furious statements. He attacks reporters. He calls the rumor a disgusting lie. He fights with the energy of a man trying to kill something from his past. But as you now understand, he wasn't just killing a rumor. He was killing a ghost. The ghost of that meeting room. The ghost of that early fear. The ghost of the question no one wanted asked. Yet decades later, when Soames was asked again, when he was no longer young, when he no longer had access to the palace, when he no longer had a reason to defend Charles with such fire, he didn't roar. He hesitated. And that hesitation is what leads us into the next chapter. the point where the early palace panic collides with the public version of the rumor. The moment the world finally learns the name that would torment Harry for the rest of his life. James Hewitt. What if the only way to silence a rumor was to take an action so drastic, so forbidden, that even whispering about it behind closed doors felt like a betrayal of the crown? And yet, someone inside the palace proposed it anyway. Every scandal has a breaking point. A moment where tension becomes panic, where a whisper becomes a plan, and where fear transforms into action. For the monarchy, that breaking point arrived quietly, without fanfare, without cameras, without headlines. It happened in a small, private conversation, one that would reshape the next 3 decades of royal speculation. Because it was during those tense days, when the palace was consumed with fear about Charles and Diana's marriage and the early whispers surrounding baby Harry, that someone proposed the unthinkable: a paternity test. Now, those words may sound simple, clinical, neutral, almost bureaucratic, but inside the monarchy, those 2 words are dynamite. They're not just a scientific procedure, they're a threat to history, legitimacy, and the carefully curated myth of royal bloodlines stretching back centuries. A paternity test inside the royal family is not just a test. It's a declaration of doubt, a crack in the foundation, a sign that the crown itself might be vulnerable. Imagine the emotional undertones. Imagine the political consequences. Imagine the personal humiliation for Charles. Imagine how it would devastate Diana. Imagine how it would darken the entire future of the monarchy. That's the context behind this moment. This wasn't idle gossip. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't a joke. This was existential fear. And fear has a way of tightening its grip until rational people start thinking irrationally. Let me take you back to the emotional climate of that time. Charles and Diana were no longer the golden couple. They were fractured, bitter, sometimes cold, sometimes explosive. Their public appearances were forced smiles. Their private moments were icy silences. And when a marriage dies inside a monarchy, it doesn't die quietly. Every argument becomes a risk. Every rumor becomes a threat. Every outsider becomes a potential leak. So when someone inside that early meeting suggested a test, the reaction mirrored the entire tragedy of the marriage itself: shock, anger, defensiveness, and then, underneath all of it, a thin layer of fragile curiosity. Because even though everyone in the room knew the timelines made sense, even though Harry looked like the Spencer side of the family, even though there was no evidence of Diana's affair with Hewitt at the time, the advisors feared what they feared, not what they knew. It's a universal truth. When trust breaks down, people stop believing what's true and start fearing what's possible. And for the monarchy, any possibility of illegitimacy is a nightmare. Now imagine the moment that suggestion lands in the room. It isn't spoken casually. It isn't floated as a joke. It's pushed into the air like a confession. A sentence said slowly, carefully, as though the speaker knows it might ruin their career. We may need to consider a test. At first, no one breathes. One advisor freezes, horrified. Another's jaw drops. A third looks down at the table, embarrassed. Someone mutters under their breath, "Absolutely not." Someone else whispers, "For God's sake." But the words hang there, immovable. And the truth is, even though everyone in the room is offended, part of them also understands why the suggestion was made. They weren't questioning Diana's loyalty. They weren't questioning Charles's paternity. They were questioning the future. A monarchy is built on stability. Scandals are storms. Illegitimacy is an earthquake. If the public ever believed Harry wasn't Charles's son, even falsely, the crown could be destabilized. Not legally, but symbolically. And symbols are everything in a monarchy. Here's where the contradiction becomes fascinating. The advisors proposing caution weren't doubting Harry. They were doubting the public. They were doubting the press. They were doubting Diana's ability to control her emotions. They were doubting Charles's ability to manage scandal. They were doubting their own ability to put the genie back in the bottle. And that doubt led to fear. Fear led to panic. Panic led to planning. Now, what would such a test look like? Who would authorize it? Who would handle the samples? Who would store the results? Who would know? Who would be kept out? And, most importantly, what would they do if the results ever leaked? These questions tore through the room like shrapnel. One advisor argued that even considering a test was an insult to Diana. Another insisted that the rumor, once born, might one day force their hand. Another suggested that if the marriage collapsed publicly, the media would resurrect the rumor with a vengeance. Another warned that Charles must never be told their conversations had reached this level of paranoia. But here is the central truth they all understood, even if they never said it aloud. A monarchy cannot survive scandal about legitimacy. It can survive affairs. It can survive divorces. It can survive rebellious princes. It can survive public criticism. It can survive political attacks. But it cannot survive a question about the bloodline. Not easily. Not quietly. Not without consequences. That is why the mere suggestion of a test electrified the room with fear. Let's focus on the psychology of Charles for a moment. Imagine being a man whose marriage is collapsing, whose wife is adored, whose own popularity is declining, whose private struggles are being whispered about in aristocratic circles. And then hearing that your advisors are discussing your son's paternity behind your back. Imagine the humiliation, the fury, the sense of betrayal. Even if Charles loved Harry completely, and by all accounts, he did, fear contaminates perception. This is the devastating thing about doubt. Once introduced, it becomes a shadow over every conversation, every newspaper headline, every joke, every whisper. This is where Nicholas Soames becomes even more relevant. He wasn't just Charles's ally. He was Charles's emotional fortress. If Charles confided in anyone about these fears, it was Soames. And if Soames sensed trouble, his instinct would be to attack the rumor with everything he had. Not because he believed it, but because he hated it. Fast forward a few years to Soames' infamous BBC interview. Listen to the fury in his voice, the indignation, the anger, the complete lack of restraint. He didn't sound like a man denying a rumor. He sounded like a man protecting the emotional wound of someone he cared about, a wound that may have first opened in that very meeting room. But let's go deeper. If the palace actually considered a paternity test back then, even briefly, it would explain a lot. Why the palace explodes with anger whenever the rumor resurfaces. Why Charles seems deeply uncomfortable when the topic is mentioned. Why Soames has always reacted so violently. Why the subject is treated as taboo. Why certain reporters mysteriously backed off. Why some royal insiders say the topic brings a unique tension. Because the rumor isn't just a lie. It's a lie that nearly caused a crisis behind closed doors. Now let's examine the emotional stakes for Diana. Imagine someone, anyone, suggesting that her love for her son was being questioned. She would be devastated. She would feel violated. She would feel slandered. She would feel stripped of dignity. Diana was sensitive. She felt deeply. She internalized pain. She trusted slowly. She forgave rarely. If she ever learned that advisors questioned Harry's paternity, even silently, she would never forget it. It would harden her. It would deepen her resentment toward the establishment. It would feed her belief that the monarchy was against her. It would push her into the arms of anyone who offered compassion. And it would shape her desire to tell her story, no matter the consequences. This moment, the whispers, the doubts, the fears, became part of the emotional foundation that would lead Diana toward panorama, toward confession, toward exposing the inner dysfunction of the monarchy to the whole world. Because once she realized the establishment had questioned her, she questioned the establishment right back. But let's return to the potential test itself. Did it happen? Was it ordered? Were samples collected? Was it merely discussed? Or was it carried out in secret? Here's the truth. No one outside the palace knows. Some insiders say yes. Some say no. Some say it was proposed, but never enacted. Some say it was enacted, but the results were destroyed. Some say it was enacted, and the results were seen by only 3 people. Some say the results became part of a secret royal file hidden away forever. The truth is hidden behind layers of secrecy, loyalty, and fear. And that is why Nicholas Soames' recent remarks sent shockwaves through the royal watching world. His words were careful, too careful. His tone was cautious, too cautious. He spoke like a man who knew more than he was allowed to say. But before we get to Soames' modern comments, we must finish the story of the original palace panic. Because what happened shortly after that internal discussion would take the rumor from a dangerous whisper to an international spectacle. Diana met James Hewitt, and the world changed. Their bond became intimate. Their affair became public. The timeline became muddled in the public mind. The rumor found a face, a red-haired face, And once the world had that image, no amount of denial could erase it. The palace had feared a rumor with no details. Now it had details. Now it had evidence. False evidence, but evidence the public believed. Now it had a villain. Now it had a narrative. Now it had a story arc. And that story arc would swallow Harry's entire life. But what happened behind the scenes? What decisions were made? What extraordinary lengths were taken to control this narrative are far more shocking than anything the public ever learned. Because if the palace considered a test once, what do you think they did when the Hewitt affair became public? That answer is where this story turns explosive. What if the truth wasn't in what the palace said, but in what it refused to say? What if the silence surrounding Prince Harry's paternity test rumors tells a story far more disturbing than any denial could? Silence is a strange thing inside royal circles. Outsiders imagine the palace as a place filled with grand speeches, elegant proclamations, and carefully crafted public statements. But insiders know the real power of royalty is not in what it speaks. It is in what it refuses to speak. Silence is a weapon, a strategy, a shield. It is also a confession, if you know how to listen. And nothing demonstrates this more clearly than the story of what happened once the world finally learned about Princess Diana's affair with James Hewitt. The moment that news broke, the palace's internal fear, once contained to secret meeting rooms, burst like a dam. Advisors panicked. Press secretaries scrambled. Charles's allies hardened themselves for battle. And Nicholas Soames stepped forward like a general preparing for war. But the real drama began not with the public reaction. It began with the private reaction. Because the moment Diana publicly admitted to infidelity, during that now infamous Panorama interview, the internal whispers that had terrified the palace years earlier resurfaced with a vengeance. Even though the timelines did not match. Even though Diana insisted the affair began after Harry's birth. Even though logic supported her. Even though facts defended her. The rumor did not care. Rumors aren't defeated by truth. They are defeated by power. And in this case, power was failing. Let's go inside the palace again, this time in the mid-1990s. The staff are tense. Phones ring nonstop. News broadcasts echo through hallways. The air feels electrified. Something enormous has been set into motion. Diana has spoken, and not in private, not quietly, not through intermediaries, but openly, proudly, defiantly. I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him, she said of James Hewitt. The world gasped. The monarchy froze. And the rumor that had been buried deep under the palace's carpets suddenly shot into global consciousness like a missile. This was the moment Harry became a target. Not because of who he was, but because of what his mother said. The public began to ask questions the palace had feared for years. If Diana had been in love with someone else. If she had found comfort elsewhere. If her marriage was empty. If she'd been lonely. If she'd turned to Hewitt emotionally and physically. Then what about Harry? It didn't matter that the timeline proved otherwise. It didn't matter that Diana met Hewitt after Harry was born. The public wasn't interested in logic. They were interested in narrative. And the narrative was irresistible. A forbidden love. A charming cavalry officer. A princess trapped in a loveless marriage. A ginger-haired boy. A prince who didn't resemble his father. A monarchy terrified of scandal. The pieces fit the story the public wanted. Even if they didn't fit reality. Now let's shift the lens to inside the palace reaction. Charles was humiliated. His staff were overwhelmed. Diana's allies were split. And Harry, still a child, was completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. But there was one man who wasn't confused. One man who believed he knew exactly what needed to be done. One man who would use his voice like a sword to cut down the rumor before it swallowed the monarchy whole. Nicholas Soames. But before we get to Soames' initial explosion, let's examine what the palace feared most. They feared the rumor would lead to one devastating question. Did the palace ever conduct a paternity test on Prince Harry? That question alone, if it ever reached the mainstream, would be catastrophic. Because if people suspected there had been a test, it implied there had been doubt. And if there had been doubt, it implied instability. And instability is poison to a monarchy. So the palace adopted a strategy that many institutions use when dealing with dangerous rumors. Never acknowledge the rumor exists. Never address the details. Never engage with the logic. Never offer evidence. Never give the story oxygen. Attack anyone who spreads it. This wasn't about truth. This was about survival. And the survival strategy depended on one key approach: control the narrative through silence and aggression. Let me explain the psychology behind that strategy. If someone denies a rumor aggressively, people assume there is fire. If someone denies a rumor casually, people assume it is harmless. But if someone refuses to address a rumor at all, refuses even to mention it, people become confused. Confusion is the monarchy's best friend. Confusion protects the crown. Confusion keeps the public guessing. Because when people are confused, they lose the ability to draw firm conclusions. But this strategy backfired spectacularly. The palace underestimated how emotionally invested the public was in Diana's story. They underestimated how much people distrusted royal advisors. They underestimated how powerful the media had become. They underestimated how quickly rumors could spread in the new global information age. And they underestimated how the lack of a clear denial or clear transparency would fuel the fire instead of smothering it. The palace's silence felt loaded. Its denials felt scripted. Its aggression felt suspicious. Its evasiveness felt meaningful. People didn't see the palace trying to protect Harry's dignity. They saw the palace trying to hide something. And that is how the rumor transformed from gossip into folklore. No longer a cheap tabloid story. No longer a whispered joke. No longer a passing interest. It became a cultural myth. But here's the part of the story most people miss. Inside the palace, during these chaotic days, some advisors revisited the forbidden conversation from years earlier. Do we need to test again? This wasn't because they doubted Harry. It was because the public doubted him. If the public ever believed a rumor, the monarchy could crumble. And the monarchy exists only because the public believes in its myth. But there was a deeper, more painful layer to this moment. A layer no one outside the palace understood. They weren't just debating a test. They were debating a betrayal. Because conducting such a test, even in secret, would mean betraying both Charles and Diana. It would mean admitting that the marriage had fallen so far that the sanity of the bloodline itself was in question. It would mean violating trust, violating emotions, violating the fundamental dignity of the family. Even in the darkest days of Charles and Diana's marriage, some lines were never meant to be crossed. And this was the line. Now enter Nicholas Soames, again. The minute the rumor hit the public, Soames knew exactly how to respond. Not with silence, not with subtlety, not with carefully crafted statements, but with rage. He went on national radio and attacked not the rumor, but anyone who dared to speak it. He called it malicious, vicious, cruel. A lie designed to humiliate the Prince of Wales. A betrayal of Diana's dignity. A defamation of the monarchy. He didn't hold back. He thundered. He roared. He used his trademark fire to shut down the entire conversation. But here's the twist. His fury told the world something the palace never wanted revealed. That the rumor mattered. That the rumor hurt. That the rumor struck at the monarchy's most vulnerable spot. That the rumor wasn't just tabloid gossip. And people sensed it. The harder he fought, the more the rumor spread. The louder he yelled, the more people whispered. The stronger his denial, the more people speculated. And the palace realized something terrifying. Their strategy wasn't working. Their silence wasn't working. Their aggression wasn't working. They had tried everything except transparency. But transparency was impossible. Because transparency would force them to answer the one question they were terrified of. Did you ever conduct a paternity test on Prince Harry? And they couldn't answer that question. Even answering no would raise questions about whether one was ever considered. And answering yes, well, that would detonate the monarchy. So they stayed silent. Soames stayed loud. And Harry became the collateral damage. Imagine being a child growing up with this rumor circulating around you. Imagine hearing jokes at school. Imagine hearing adults whispering. Imagine seeing your face on tabloids next to the face of the man your mother once loved. Imagine being compared to Hewitt, not for who you are, but for what your hair looks like. Harry once admitted he heard the rumor as a teenager. Imagine the pain of that moment. Imagine the confusion. Imagine the humiliation. And imagine the palace doing nothing to protect him from it. Because protecting him would require speaking about something they refused to acknowledge. That is the tragedy of this chapter. Not the rumor, but the silence. Because the silence became a story. The silence became a clue. The silence became a mystery. And mysteries, in the royal world, never die. But while the world was obsessing over James Hewitt, And while Harry was growing up under the weight of this rumor, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something darker. Something far more explosive. Someone inside the palace, someone with knowledge, someone with authority, began hinting that the truth about the paternity test rumors wasn't what the public believed. And that someone was Nicholas Soames. Because years later, when asked again about Harry's parentage, he didn't repeat his earlier fury. He didn't deny the rumor with fire. He didn't shut it down with force. He hesitated. And hesitation is dangerous. Because silence tells a story. But hesitation reveals a secret. What happens when a man who has spent his entire adult life defending the monarchy suddenly turns into its fiercest verbal weapon? What happens when Nicholas Soames, Churchill's grandson, Charles's enforcer, the palace's unofficial battering ram, steps in front of a microphone and unleashes a fury so volcanic it shocks even his political enemies? Every palace rumor has a moment where it crosses the invisible line between quiet gossip and national crisis. And for the Harry paternity whisper, that moment came with an interview no one expected, no one was prepared for, and no one has ever forgotten. It was the moment that transformed Nicholas Soames from a discreet royal ally into a public figurehead for the monarchy's rage. A moment that told the world the palace wasn't just concerned, it was terrified. Because if there is one thing Soames was known for, it is this. He never spoke unless he meant to destroy something. And on this day, he wanted to destroy the rumor. Burn it. Crush it. Erase it from existence. But instead, he did the opposite. Let me take you back to that afternoon. The studio lights were bright. The air was tense. The BBC presenter, a man known for pressing uncomfortable questions, leaned back in his chair, eyebrows slightly raised, poised like a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. Soames had agreed to appear on the program reluctantly, pulled in by advisors who believed he was the only person loud, authoritative, and intimidating enough to crush the story. They wanted a hammer. They wanted a roar. They wanted a man who could terrify journalists into silence. And Nicholas Soames was built for that role. He walked into the studio with the same energy he carried into political debates, broad, intimidating, eyes sharp, voice ready to erupt. He wasn't there to explain. He wasn't there to clarify. He wasn't there to soothe. He was there to intimidate. When the presenter asked, casually, almost too casually, "So, Mr. Soames, these rumors about Harry's parentage, what do you make of them?" Soames snapped. He didn't sigh. He didn't smirk. He didn't dismiss the question with calm confidence. He detonated. Disgusting, he barked. One word. One explosion. One verbal missile. The presenter blinked, startled. But Soames wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice rising, each word delivered like a blow. It is a vile, contemptible lie, a vicious slander, an attack on the dignity of a child and his parents. The people who spread this filth should be ashamed of themselves. His voice didn't just fill the room, it swallowed it. The producer inside the control booth froze. The sound technicians exchanged glances. Even the presenter, no stranger to political meltdowns, looked caught between fascination and alarm. Soames wasn't answering a question. He was declaring war. His rant continued, escalating with each breath. "These malicious rumors," he boomed, "are the work of people who want to destroy the royal family, who thrive on cruelty, who seek to undermine the institution that has served this country for centuries." He thundered on about loyalty, honor, duty, and betrayal. But here is where the psychology becomes fascinating. When someone is calm, people believe them. When someone is emotional, people feel their sincerity. But when someone becomes enraged, truly enraged, people don't think, "Ah, he's honest." They think, "Why is he so defensive?" Soames meant to crush the rumor, but his fury poured gasoline on it. Because there is a fine line between defending truth and over-defending secrets. And in that moment, to millions watching at home, Nicholas Soames wasn't defending truth. He was defending something else. Something fragile. Something hidden. Something dangerous. Something that, if exposed, would hurt the monarchy. Let me ask you a direct question, the kind of question your viewers will lean in to hear. Why did Nicholas Soames respond with nuclear fury to a rumor that should have been easily dismissed? After all, if the rumor was truly ridiculous, if the idea was genuinely laughable, wouldn't a calm chuckle have been more effective? Wouldn't a relaxed denial have sufficed? Wouldn't a wave of the hand and a "don't be absurd" have shut it down? But Soames didn't laugh. He didn't shrug. He didn't minimize. He erupted. Because in the fictionalized royal universe we're building, Soames knows the full history behind the rumor. He knows it wasn't simply tabloid trash. He knows the palace once whispered about it. He knows advisors once panicked about it. He knows the idea of a test was once discussed. He knows how fragile the monarchy felt during the Charles and Diana wars. And when a man knows there were secret conversations behind closed doors, conversations no one is ever supposed to mention, he reacts differently. He reacts like a man fighting ghosts. And that is the tragedy and brilliance of this moment. Soames wasn't reacting to the rumor itself. He was reacting to its history. He was reacting to what he remembered, what he overheard, what Charles told him privately, what advisors whispered in panic, what Diana confided to friends, what he knew, not just about the rumor, but about the fear behind it. Because, in this dramatic universe, Soames carries knowledge that the public can't access. And knowledge is a heavy thing. It weighs on a man. It shapes his reactions. It turns him into the version of himself that appears on camera, furious, explosive, unable to contain the pressure. Now let's examine the fallout. Immediately after the interview, royal reporters scrambled to respond. Some praised Soames' defense. Some mocked his tone. Some said he overreacted. Some said he told the truth. Some said he looked unhinged. But universally, every single headline, every single conversation, every single debate had one thing in common. Nicholas Soames had turned a rumor into a story. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but emotionally. People started saying things like, "Why was he so angry? He knows something." That wasn't a normal denial. Something doesn't add up. What is he hiding? Why did he lose his temper like that? Is he protecting Charles? Or protecting the monarchy? And this is where the narrative in your fictional royal universe shifts dramatically. Soames' anger didn't make the rumor weaker. It made it stronger. Because for the first time, the public understood something the palace desperately wanted to hide. This rumor touched a real nerve. But now let's zoom in on Soames himself. The man behind the meltdown. The man whose loyalty was legendary. The man whose voice had defended Charles since university days. To understand this moment fully, we need to understand the relationship between Soames and Charles. They weren't just friends. They weren't just allies. They were bonded by decades of private conversations. Conversations about love, pain, duty, betrayal, media scrutiny, and the brutal pressures of royal life. Soames saw Charles at his lowest. Saw him break. Saw him lose Diana emotionally long before their marriage officially collapsed. Inside your dramatic universe, Soames was the one Charles confided in. The rumors hurt. The whispers won't stop. "I can't bear for Harry to grow up with this. How do I protect my son?" These are the conversations that shaped Soames' fiery public defense. He wasn't just defending Charles. He was defending the child Charles loved. He was defending the emotional wound he had witnessed firsthand. He was defending the monarchy from a rumor he knew had nearly caused panic years earlier. And yet, fury is a dangerous tool, and it cracked open something the palace couldn't contain. Because when Soames finished the interview, red-faced, breath heavy, hands shaking, he believed he had done the right thing. He believed he had crushed the rumor. He believed he had defended Harry. He left the studio feeling victorious. But victory lasted only 24 hours. Because reporters replayed the interview, and replayed it again, and replayed it in slow motion, and replayed it with commentary, and replayed it with analysis. They noted every eyebrow twitch, every pause, every inflection, every flash of panic, every burst of anger, and they tore it apart like vultures. Some journalists suggested the anger came from guilt. Some said it came from fear. Some said Soames looked like a man hiding a scandal. Some said his behavior was too emotional for the topic. Some said he looked like someone who had rehearsed the denial but not the emotion. And that is when the rumor, once a quiet joke, once a small whisper, exploded across the world. But what makes this chapter truly explosive in your dramatic universe is this. Years later, when Soames was older, when the monarchy had evolved, when Diana was gone, when Harry was grown, someone asked him the same question again. This time, he did not thunder. He did not roar. He did not attack. He paused. A pause that lasted too long. A pause that made journalists lean forward. A pause that created a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed every rumor, every whisper, every piece of speculation the palace had spent decades trying to bury. And his answer, quiet, careful, almost gentle, changed everything. But what he said, and what he didn't say, is a mystery that leads us directly into the next chapter. A chapter where hesitation becomes the biggest clue of all. A chapter where Soames' silence becomes the loudest statement he ever made. What if the biggest shock...